This Sunday, a crisis of confidence. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas faces growing scrutiny for failing to disclose payments and gifts from a top Republican donor.
The reputation of the court is at stake.
And a new report reveals Thomas's wife received secret payments from an activist with business before the court.
I do think that there's work that the Supreme Court should do to address those perception problems.
With public confidence in the court at a record low, what can be done to restore Americans' trust in the judicial branch? Plus, default danger. As the deadline nears for the government to pay its bills, President Biden faces off with House Republicans who want to negotiate spending cuts.
We're not a deadbeat nation. We pay our bills.
Does President Biden have a plan to get Republicans to work with him?
We're the only ones to lift the debt limit to make sure this economy is not in jeopardy.
President Biden has produced a budget. House Republicans produced a ransom note.
I'll talk to House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries. And guilty as charged. 4 members of the far-right Proud Boys were found guilty of the high crime of seditious conspiracy. It's the 3rd time the Justice Department has secured convictions for the January 6th attack.
Our work will continue.
What do these convictions mean for a potential prosecution of Donald Trump for his role in trying to overturn the 2020 election? I'll talk to former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, who is challenging Trump for the Republican nomination. Joining me for insight and analysis are NBC News senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Haig, Maria Teresa Kumar, president of Voto Latino, Mark Leibovich of The Atlantic, and Republican strategist Sarah Fagan. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history, this is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
Good Sunday morning. Before we get to politics, it's another shooting. At least 8 people are dead, including children, after a gunman opened fire at a suburban outlet mall in Allen, Texas, not far from Dallas, before the gunman was shot and killed by a police officer who happened to be there. This is the 2nd deadliest mass shooting this calendar year. When we came on the air last week, by the way, we were following the manhunt for another Texas gunman who had fatally shot 5 people after he was asked by a neighbor to simply stop firing his gun in his yard. This week, 6 people were killed in Henrietta, Oklahoma. In Atlanta, a gunman opened fire in a waiting room at a medical office building, killing 1 and injuring 4 others. And yet, despite the uptick in mass shootings this year, there's been no change in the political response to this growing gun violence crisis. It's yet another example of our broken political situation where polarization has made governing and any action impossible. The bases of both parties punish anybody that seeks any sort of common ground. We're seeing it in the response to the judicial branch, where there is clearly a growing cancer on the Supreme Court. A body that used to pride itself on judicial independence is now perceived as just another partisan branch of government in a polarized nation. In the eyes of the American public, the justices' robes are not black anymore. They're red and blue. Last year, just 1 in 4 Americans said they had a great deal of confidence or quite a bit of confidence in the Supreme Court, according to Gallup, the lowest rating in 50 years. And that was after the leak of the draft Dobbs opinion on abortion and before what we're dealing with right now, which is a slew of ethics issues involving the justices. What started out as a story about Justice Clarence Thomas accepting luxury vacations from a billionaire donor has become a flood of headlines questioning the court's overall ethics, and Thomas himself with a private school tuition for Thomas's great-nephew being paid for, paying for Thomas's mother's home, paying for hundreds of thousands of dollars to a nonprofit that then paid a 6-figure salary to Thomas's wife, Ginny. And there was another report this week of a conservative activist paying Ginny Thomas under the table while he had business before the court. Thomas has not responded to any of the most recent charges, and after the first story came out about the vacations, he issued a statement simply saying he didn't believe the trips with, quote, close personal friends were reportable. Now, Democrats are demanding a formal ethics code for the Supreme Court, which right now has no binding code of ethical conduct, like the one that actually governs every other federal judge in America. But most Republicans right now, afraid of angering the base or looking like you're giving the left anything, are rallying around Thomas, using whataboutism and rejecting any tightening of ethics rules.
He's obviously been targeted because he's a conservative black man, and he's on the Supreme Court in an effort to undercut the legitimacy of the court.
Many people, some in the media, many in Congress, want to make this about Justice Thomas. But you can't make this issue about Justice Thomas unless you're willing to make it about any number of other justices who had very similar situations that they're dealing with.
Now, the same broken partisan politics that are eroding the Supreme Court's reputation are making it impossible for members of Congress to move forward and make deals and legislate, whether it's on addressing mass shootings, on immigration, Title 42 is set to expire, or on the debt limit with the risk of default coming as soon as the end of this month. So as leaders from both parties prepare to meet at the White House on Tuesday, President Biden, who claims he's not negotiating right now on the debt ceiling, is clearly preparing to negotiate on the debt ceiling. But he clearly hopes that he can drive a wedge between Republicans as he does it.
There's a Republican Party and there's the MAGA Republicans. And the MAGA Republicans really have put him in a position where, in order to stay Speaker, he has to agree, he's agreed to things that maybe he believes, but are just extreme.
And joining me now is the House Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries of New York. Congressman Jeffries, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good morning. Great to be on.
Well, let's start with this meeting you're going to have with the group of 4 congressional leaders and the president. It'll include Speaker McCarthy, Senate Majority Leader Schumer, and the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell and yourself. I guess we should call these talks, not negotiations, or is anything on the table, or is this a negotiation?
Well, it's a very important discussion. I'm thankful that President Biden has called us together. We need to do 2 things. One, we have to make sure that America pays its bills to avoid a dangerous default on our debt in a manner that will blow up the United States economy, likely trigger a job-killing recession, cost us millions of good-paying jobs, crash the stock market, which of course will adversely impact the retirement security of millions of Americans, and it will dramatically raise costs for almost everyone. That has to be avoided. And the one way to do that is to make sure that we raise the debt ceiling in a manner consistent with what has been done more than 100 times under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. At the same time, Chuck, President Biden has continued to make clear that we can have a discussion about the right balance of spending, investments, and revenues to make life better for everyday Americans, to impact in a favorable way the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people.
So do you accept the premise that you're not going to get a clean debt ceiling hike?
I do not, because we have a constitutional responsibility to make sure that we protect the full faith and credit of the United States of America. Everyday Americans understand this principle. If you have a bill, you need to pay it. If you fail to pay it, it's going to adversely impact your credit rating. Your credit score will drop. If your credit score drops, your costs are going to go up. And if America defaults on our bills, that's exactly what is going to happen, and everyone is going to pay the price. And so I accept the premise that the only responsible thing to do is to do what Democrats did in the previous administration, where we helped President Trump raise the debt ceiling and avoid a default 3 different times, notwithstanding the fact that in our 247-year history, 25% of America's debt was acquired during the Trump administration. And yet we avoided a default without gamesmanship, without showmanship, without partisanship. That's what the extreme MAGA Republicans should do this time around.
I understand what you want them to do, but as you know, the Republicans don't accept that premise. You have almost every Senate Republican, 43 of them, saying that they're not going to raise the debt ceiling without some sort of quid pro quo on cuts or something like that. You've got independent groups, including the Chamber of Commerce, including the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, which is normally a pretty nonpartisan group. They have said, hey, look, Republicans have done their job. You may not like the bill the House passed, but they did do something. What shouldn't Democrats respond with a counter proposal?
Well, President Biden has consistently made clear, and in fact, he introduced his budget 2 months ago, and it is a budget that will invest and protect in Social Security. It's going to try to strengthen the economy in a way that builds an economy that works for everyday Americans, an economy from the middle out and the ground up, not the top down. And President Biden's budget will also cut the deficit by $3 trillion. We've been waiting for months for the Republicans to articulate their position. They didn't produce a budget. What they did was produce a ransom note. That is what the Default on America Act is. And effectively what they're saying to the American people is that either you accept these dramatic cuts to Medicaid spending for disabled children and for elderly Americans, cuts to law enforcement, cuts to education, cuts to health care, cuts to nutrition assistance for food insecure Americans, more than 30 million people throughout the country. Either Republicans want us to accept these dramatic cuts or accept a catastrophic default on our nation's debt. That is what is the unreasonable position, and hopefully in a few days, Republicans will come to their senses and do what's right by the American people.
Is the obvious solution here a short-term punt, and it looks like this? You essentially raise the debt ceiling through September 30th and make the debt ceiling and the budget deadlines converge. Doesn't that give everybody what they want? You didn't negotiate cuts directly for the raising of the debt ceiling, and you do give the Republicans get their budget negotiations with the budget. Isn't that the uncomfortable compromise that is the best way forward here?
Well, I don't think the responsible thing to do is to kick the can down the road. When President Biden has been saying for months, the position of Leader Schumer, the position of House Democrats has been we have to avoid a default. America should pay its bills, protect the full faith and credit of the United States of America, but we, of course, are open to having a discussion about what type of investments, what type of spending, what type of revenues are appropriate in order to protect the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people. That's a process that is available to us right now. I don't think we need to delay those discussions for a few months.
I understand that, but are you ruling it out? I mean, if that's the way out of this, no one's saying, look, there are better ways out of a lot of problems. The question is, if it avoids default, is this a way out?
Well, we have to avoid default, period, full stop. I think what's in front of us right now is that President Biden has convened a very important discussion on Tuesday so we can find a way forward to do what is necessary to continue to strengthen our economy in a manner that benefits everyday Americans.
Let me ask it this way. Are you following President Biden's lead here? That if President Biden and Speaker McCarthy come up with some sort of handshake in some form here, are congressional Democrats going to support the president's position?
Well, we're in lockstep right now in terms of the path forward that President Biden laid out. Ultimately, everyone evaluates on the merits any particular piece of legislation that is presented to us, but we are in lockstep with President Biden. We're in lockstep with Senate Democrats. We want to do the right thing for the American people. That means paying our bills and simultaneously having this discussion about the future and what spending can look like, anchored in President Biden's budget proposal.
I want to ask you a couple other questions on some things that are happening this week. Biden, the Title 42 is going to end this week. Do you believe the administration is prepared for what's coming to the border?
I do believe the administration is prepared. I know Secretary Mayorkas was down at the border this week. Steps are being taken to make sure that there is order at the border, but that it should be done in a way that is consistent with two principles. One, the rule of law, but two, our history as a compassionate nation, as a nation of immigrants. And I think that the administration is preparing in an all-hands-on-deck way to make sure that when we move beyond this Title 42 moment, that we're in position to absorb what takes place. At the same time, we need to begin to have a real bipartisan discussion on comprehensive immigration reform, and I hope that my Republican colleagues will come to the table to have those discussions.
I know you have confidence in the plan. A lot of border Democrats do not. Mark Kelly, I don't have a high level of confidence. Ruben Gallego, I have heard repeated concerns about a lack of information. Kirsten Sinema, I know is not a Democrat anymore, but caucuses with them. Despite our repeated calls, the administration failed to prepare a working plan for the end of Title 42. Let me ask you this. In the next couple of weeks, if this doesn't look like it's working, would you be in favor of reinstating Title 42 powers. There's a bill in the Senate that might do that. Is that something that, if this doesn't work, you'd be open to?
No, I think that's a premature discussion. I think we have to deal with the situation that is in front of us right now and support the administration efforts to make sure that there are resources at the border to deal with a post-Title 42 environment, and to do it in a way, as I mentioned, consistent with both the rule of law. We want order at the border. At the same time, do it in a compassionate way and in a way that is consistent with who we are, our values as a nation.
And one final straight-up political question. There's a new Washington Post ABC poll out this morning, and it has a startling divide on the economy between former President Trump and current President Biden. You just made a robust case that President Biden has been a good steward for the economy. The country here in this poll, a majority believe former President Trump did a better job of handling the economy at 54% than President Biden does right now at 36%. Why do you think the public perception of the president's handling the economy is so poor compared to the numbers you were citing?
Well, that's one poll, and I've seen other public opinion surveys that have indicated that there's a closer approximation between the actual reality of the incredible job that President Biden has done with respect to the economy. Record low unemployment, more than 12 million good-paying jobs have been created. He reduced the deficit by $1.7 trillion during President Biden's first 2 years. That's a record for a similar period of time in American history for any president. But of course, President Biden recognizes that more needs to be done to continue to build out an economy that benefits everyday Americans coming out of COVID and an inflationary environment. I think when it's all said and done and President Biden is on the campaign trail, able to make his case against the extreme MAGA Republicans who are extreme on reproductive freedom, extreme on democracy, extreme on Social Security and Medicare, extreme in their unwillingness to deal with the gun violence epidemic and crisis, extreme on pretty much every issue out there. I believe that the American people will see fit to reelect President Biden and reelect him comfortably.
House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries from Brooklyn, New York. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective with us, sir. Good to see you.
Thank you, Chuck.
When we come back, he called for Donald Trump to drop out of the race. But how will he appeal to Trump's loyal base of supporters? Former Arkansas governor and newly minted Republican presidential candidate Asa Hutchinson joins me next. Welcome back. He's been called the 2024 candidate Democrats should fear and the ideal candidate for a GOP that no longer exists. Asa Hutchinson is a former U.S. attorney, the Arkansas Republican Party chair, a 3-term member of Congress. He served as a House impeachment manager during Bill Clinton's impeachment. President George W. Bush appointed him director of the DEA and later an undersecretary in the Department of Homeland Security. He left office in January after 2 terms as governor of Arkansas. And last week, Hutchinson, who has stood out in the Republican field for his willingness to publicly take on Donald Trump, formally announced his presidential campaign.
We have learned that in times of turmoil, uncertainty, and division, America has always benefited from leaders who challenge us and give us hope. I am running for President of the United States because I know that the best of America is ahead of us.
And the former governor of Arkansas and Republican presidential candidate Asa Hutchinson joins me now. Governor Hutchinson, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you, Chuck. It's always good to be with you.
You know, I think the single most important speech any candidate for president gives is that announcement speech. I always feel like it's the speech that truly comes from the candidate, that it hasn't had a lot of consultants in it and speech writers. Over time, that happens. I get that. But that first one, it's what I found from it is it feels like you were running to lead a party from 10 years ago. And you probably know what I mean by that. Do you really think you have a message for a post-Trump era in an era where Donald Trump still exists?
No, I think the message that I presented is about the future. Whenever you look at the rule of law, which I talked about, the challenge of crime in our cities, the challenge of border security, that's where we simply need to enforce the law, and that is the background that I bring to this campaign. And whenever you look at reducing the size of the federal government and controlling spending, I presented the idea, the plan to reduce federal civilian employment by 10%. I can do that because we reduced it by 14% in Arkansas. And so these are specific plans that I present, and it's about the future. It's about the strength of America. It's about our leadership. So no, it's not about the past. It's about the future, and I think that resonates.
Look, it does seem as if, though, that having the right positions that maybe the Republican Party supports in a poll doesn't seem to translate to votes. I look at your positions, and in theory, it makes a ton of sense to me that you should be able to unite this party around what you're selling. But as you know, they're looking for something else. Donald Trump, whatever it is, it's a fighter. He says what I think. You've heard all the different words. How do you appeal to that voter that actually likes the pugilism?
That's true, and you've got to convince the voters that you're going to fight for them. And whenever you look at my history of fighting against the establishment in Arkansas, but also in Congress and balancing the budget, this is proof of a record of somebody who does fight for them. And whenever you look at growing the economy and the challenge of the high interest rates, high inflation, economy is the #1 issue that will face Americans as we go into 2024. And so you talk about these and that you're willing to fight for them. That's what they want, but they also want somebody that can win. So it's about policy, but it's about electability. And we do not want to have a repeat of 2020 with a Trump-Biden race. We want something different that we can win, and that's the case that we make.
Why do you think right now Republican voters think Donald Trump's the best candidate?
Well, really, you look back to the true numbers, which is after the last midterm elections, and his numbers were down. He was responsible for a lot of the failure and growth that we expected and wins in a number of different states. And so his numbers were down. Since then, his numbers have gone up because he's played the victim. People believe he's been picked on because of some prosecutions. I joke in some ways that his campaign manager is Alvin Bragg in New York City. That indictment caused those numbers to go up because they don't believe they're fair. This will settle out over time, and so let's judge it understanding that we're early in the campaign. We've got a lot of room to grow.
It's funny you bring up the legal issues, the seditious conspiracy convictions of the Proud Boys. That was a tall task for justice to prove that case. They were able to prove it. You have experience dealing in the Justice Department as a former U.S. attorney. Were you surprised they were successful, and do you think this is a dire outcome for the former president?
Well, they are difficult cases to make. It's a high bar, and they were successful in it. And I think it really reflects the seriousness of the offense of January 6th in undermining our democracy and how seriously the jury considers this, that found them guilty of that. Whenever you look at the impact on the future, Donald Trump has a moral responsibility for what happened on January 6th. The question is whether there is a criminal responsibility, and that's a judgment that the Department of Justice is going to have to make. I believe that we're going to have in America to go a different direction, but it's going to be through the ballot box and not what happens in the courtroom. And so that's what I want to focus on, is persuading Americans that we need to go a different direction.
Are you committing to support the Republican nominee, even if it is Donald Trump?
I expect to be on the debate stage. We're still looking at what is required for that in terms of the pledge. But yes, I'm sure that the candidates that are going to be participating in that believe they're going to be the nominee, and so we're going to support the nominee. But I want to be on that debate stage. I think it's important, and we're working very hard to get there. And let's see. We're not sure whether Donald Trump's going to be there or not. I hope that he will be. I think it's important, but let's see how that develops.
Do you think if he doesn't show up to the debates, it makes it easier for you not to commit to support the nominee?
Well, that reflects the question as to who he will support if he's not the nominee. But he'll drop in the polls, and that's why I think he will ultimately be there. It's important for the American public to hear, particularly the Republican voters, to hear what the candidates say about the future, their ideas for it, and to engage in that debate and defend their position. So that's what the expectation is, and I think everybody has an obligation to participate in that.
A couple of tricky policy issues that are very divisive, or else we'd have resolved them by now. We had a lot more mass shootings again this week, what we saw in Texas at an outlet mall. Let me ask you this. Do all of these recent shootings took place in states that have expanded the rights of gun owners? If we want to tackle the mental health issue, how do you do it without regulating the firearm?
Well, I mean, first of all, we've had mass shootings that occurred in blue states and states that have significant restrictions on firearms. And so they happen across America. And Chuck, this is a serious issue for us. It breaks everyone's heart and causes everybody to think, what can we do to prevent this or to reduce the deaths by violence? And so, as you said, the mental health is a significant part of it that we need to invest in. And you talked earlier about there's, not any bipartisan consensus. And we did find last year a bipartisan consensus to address some issues after the Uvalde shooting in Texas. And I applaud Senator Cornyn for his leadership on that. So we just have to continue to look at what makes a difference, what fits within our constitutional framework. And right now there is the consensus on addressing the mental health crisis we have in America, particularly as it came out of the pandemic.
Let me ask you this about the current crisis of confidence with the Supreme Court. Back in the late 90s when you were in Congress, you led a bipartisan effort. There was a rebuke, an ethics investigation of then Speaker Newt Gingrich. And you led a bipartisan effort. And, hey, this is what was concluded, and it was a bipartisan action. He had to pay a pretty hefty fine. But it was accepted by the public because it was bipartisan. Do we need that here with the Supreme Court? It feels like there isn't an accepting of the premise that the court has an ethical problem right now.
Well, this is an important issue, and whenever you look at the confidence of the Supreme Court, which is critical to operation of our democracy, that confidence level is somewhat down. But if you look back in history, you had during the Warren Court, they had a controversial decision, Brown versus Board of Education. And for a long time, the court was under extraordinary criticism. The confidence level was diminished. That has been built back up over time. You've had a controversial decision, and history is repeating itself. You've got, in this case, the Democrats undermining the court, first of all, by wanting to pack it more than 9, which has been our historic number. And then secondly, these allegations against Justice Thomas. The court needs to be transparent, first of all. They need to be clear on what their reporting rules are. They need to review those to make sure they're very similar to the other public officials in branches of government, which has broad reporting requirements. Clearly have not been sufficient. They've changed those. Right. But I think they need to step just simply in terms of their transparency so the American people understand what the rules are and what is required, and is similar to other public officials.
Sounds like you think Chief Justice Roberts, you think he needs to come out and publicly state what you just said?
Well, sure. I think there needs to be a clear set of rules, and there needs to be openness about it so that everybody knows what the rules are. Those are important. Every public official has to follow those. They can set those. They should set those versus the Congress of the United States, because they are a separate branch of government.
Right. Governor Asa Hutchinson, the former governor of Arkansas, presidential candidate, just announced this week. Appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective, and stay safe on the trail, sir. We'll see you again.
Thank you, Chuck. Good to be with you.
Before we go to break, on Saturday, millions of people watched the coronation of King Charles III, the first British monarch to be crowned in 70 years. The ceremony raises lots of questions about the future of the royal family, with the public finding its role in modern democracy increasingly insignificant. During a 1969 tour of North America, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the father of King Charles, appeared on Meet the Press to defend the monarchy.
Your Highness, there have been reports which say that the British monarchy gets its strength and popularity because it hasn't changed. And then I've seen some that says it gets its strength and popularity because it has changed and become more modern. What's your opinion on that?
Well, different things have changed. I think when people say that it has its strength from not changing, I think there is a sense of continuity. The fact that you have roughly the same people around all the time, it gives the community a sense that whatever changes there are, at least there's something that doesn't change all the time. And I think this is a great strength, I think, a great advantage.
When we come back, the growing ethics allegations against Clarence Thomas and the fight over the debt ceiling, both battles reveal the deep partisan divides that animate our current political climate. Panel is next. Welcome back, panelists here. Maria Teresa Kumar, president of Voto Latino. NBC News senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Hake. Mark Leibovich, a staff writer at The Atlantic, and Republican strategist Sarah Fagan. I want to start with the court, and then we'll pivot to debt ceiling, but sort of to set up the conversation. We're going to hear from John Roberts from about 15 years ago and Clarence Thomas at his confirmation hearing regarding ethics, conflicts of interest, and the Supreme Court.
I think the most important thing for the public to understand is that we're not a political branch of government. They don't elect us. If they don't like what we're doing, it's more or less just too bad.
We are, as judges, in the least democratic branch of government. We have lifetime appointments. We make very, very important decisions, and we do not stand for re-election. I may talk about the flaws, but I also point out the importance of the legislative and oversight process. This process is necessary, and it has, to me, become more clearly necessary since I became a judge.
And Garrett Hake, what was interesting about that response from then Judge Thomas, it was about acknowledging, hey, this process has been you haven't enjoyed it. And he's basically saying, no, I haven't, but look, this is what Congress's job. You could argue he's almost inviting, okay, try to write an ethics code.
Yeah, and they can try. But right now, the ethics code that other federal judges follow wasn't one that's written by Congress, and it's not clear that Congress could write anything that would actually be enforceable. I mean, what's the mechanism that you would put over the Supreme Court to put an ethics code in place? You played some of my interview with Tom Tillis earlier this week, and he was practically begging Justice Roberts to kind of get a hold of this, to get in front of it, that only the Supreme Court could put something in place to increase confidence in the Supreme Court that they're even taking this seriously. Yeah. That seems to be the only real road here.
It does, and I guess I don't want to. You were in the Bush White House when John Roberts was picked. This is not who he is, but I gotta think, will he meet this moment? He needs to do something.
Well, I think he probably will get forced to do something. I mean, the partisan nature of what is going on in life today, in politics today, is why we see so much scrutiny on the court and on these justices. And there's been a standard on Thomas since the minute he stepped on the Supreme Court, which is that liberals have wanted to take him out. And he's, in some degrees, made the criticism easy, but I don't think they're going to let up. And so it's going to force the court is going to be forced to do something. You know,
Maria Teresa, it is interesting already. It's like I've heard the Republicans say, hey, well, they've always come after Thomas. And Republicans are then going after Sonia Sotomayor. And it's like, okay, all 9 justices will end up looking terrible once political operatives are done with them in 3 months. How do we put a stop to this?
Well, I think we have to take a step back and recognize that there's really 3 issues before us. One, we recognize that I don't think the founding fathers actually believed that corruption was part of the courts. And I say this because, in tongue-in-cheek, because Clarence Thomas is an originalist, and I don't think the founding fathers had this in mind. But if we were to take a look of where the money came from and what was it impacting, that's what the people need to investigate. Look, I'm a layperson. I'm absolutely not a constitutional lawyer. But if you look at the funding that even his wife, Ginny, received under the table, it was with someone that had business before the court in the Voting Rights Act that changed the course of history. And so I do think that when you look at his docket, when you look at where he chose not to recuse himself, recognizing that there was business before the court, that's a broader issue. And then the third part, what are the future cases that he hasn't recused himself from? We now have a Supreme Court case that is under review that basically guts the authority of federal agencies such as the EPA and such as the FDA, and basically concentrates the power on judges. That's an issue for the American people.
Mark Leibovich, I do think that the other source of blame here for the current corrosive nature of the Supreme Court is the United States Senate. They have essentially destroyed the confirmation process and created an entire judiciary that is red and blue.
Yes, and that's, in that sense, the idea that it's not a political body, that is not true anymore. I will say, though, the idea that liberals are going after Clarence Thomas. I mean, as a member of the Church of Print Journalism here, the reporting on this from ProPublica, which is a great investigative journalism organization, is rock solid. This is damning stuff, and Justice Roberts is right. We have to live with it because they're not, going to stand for elections. But yes, I mean, it's political, but at the same time, this is a issue of right and wrong.
It is. I do think it falls under this larger issue of an impossible. Nobody can concede when their side is ever doing wrong. I'm going to move to the debt ceiling because we did some statistical analysis of the current makeup of Congress, Garrett. Just 27% of Congress was in office in 2011, the last time we had debt ceiling. Fewer than 1 in 4 Republicans, fewer than a little bit more than 1 in 4 Democrats. This tells me that the warnings may be falling on deaf ears.
I think that's absolutely true based on the conversations I've had on the Hill. I mean, there are a number of people, particularly Republicans, who don't think either the deadline is real or the consequences will be as severe as they've been suggested to be. I mean, it's hot potato with a live grenade, basically, at this point. And I think what may happen is we may have to get really close to that deadline and see actual consequences before this gets serious. I mean, I talked to some sources on the Democratic side who don't expect much to come out of this meeting with President Biden even this week, that we might need to see the markets start to panic a little bit before people start to understand that this is not a theoretical conversation anymore.
Sarah, as we were talking, there's only a political loss here for either party, right? There's no win anymore, is there?
It'd be pretty hard to see. There's actually a scenario where the president and the House Republicans win, which is if they came together in a compromise, which seems pretty hard at this point.
Right, and both saying, boy, you're both great. Yeah, good luck with that.
But a funny thing happened on the way to economic catastrophe by Republicans is that they passed a spending plan.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's a pretty good political argument to say, we're going to raise the debt ceiling and we're going to hold spending to 2022 levels. That's not exactly austere.
Yeah, it does mean that the president needs to negotiate, don't you think, Marie?
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons when you look at the Republicans that said, I voted for something for McCarthy, even though I would not have voted had it passed. It speaks to that there's so much in there that is good for Republicans that they want the president actually to come in and be almost their barrier to be able to proceed. And I do think it's going to be temporary fixes, unfortunately.
The short-term punt, that's the way Washington works.
Well, that's the way it looks. I mean, certainly the September solution. But I also think, look, we can look forward to more kicking the can down the road metaphors for the next few weeks. But look, that is the other thing. The other issue here is it's a much more reckless Congress, but it's also a much tighter margin. I mean, Kevin McCarthy has 4 votes to work with. A lot of those votes are in districts that Trump won.
We're going to crash into guardrails. Let's just hope we don't end up in a ditch.
Yes.
All right, guys. Up next, how the Republican Party is taking the culture war fight to another level. Our new reporting from Tennessee, which arguably has become ground zero for this new fight.
Some of these sexually explicit.
Welcome back. This week we are debuting a brand new season of Meet the Press Reports, our 6th, by the way. Each week on Meet the Press Reports, we take a deep dive into a single topic. And this time, we take a look at the GOP's efforts to restrict drag. It is the newest front amid a wave of anti-LGBTQ laws that have passed various Republican state legislatures nationwide over the last few years. Our own Antonia Hilton reports from all across the state of Tennessee, which became the first state in the country to pass an anti-drag law in March. And although the law has now been temporarily blocked by a federal judge, its impacts are already being felt by performers like Story Van Ness.
As a transgender woman raised in Tennessee, she spent years hiding who she was. It wasn't until she turned 18 and stepped out onto her first drag show stage that she realized it didn't have to be that way.
and I didn't have the words for it. It was one of the few times I felt powerful, I felt seen, I felt right in my skin. I can do anything I need to do when I'm in drag.
Wait, are all the children out of the building? Are there any children? Look around. If you're a child, raise your hand. Not emotionally, I mean like legally.
For Story and her friend who performs under the name Harry Scary, it's begun to feel like their very existence is a political act.
The agenda is to just exist and to feel valid.
The agenda is to be able to go to the bathroom without having to worry about being punched in the face.
State Senate Majority Leader Jack Johnson, a Republican from Franklin, Tennessee, sponsored the new restrictive legislation. The law targets adult-oriented performances that are harmful to minors. It doesn't say exactly how performances will be determined to be harmful or sexual.
Have you been to drag shows?
Have not. But I've seen videos. I've seen videos of drag. Well, and I guess I should say, have I been to places where a man was dressed as a woman and performing or singing, and maybe they were dressed, it was a Halloween party and they were dressed up as Dolly Parton? Of course I have.
Are you trying to send a signal?
Of course
that
not.
Some types of communities, some types of people aren't welcome here in Tennessee?
The only signal I'm trying to send is that you shouldn't be doing sexually graphic, you shouldn't be simulating sex acts in front of children.
You can watch the full episode on this anti-drag movement right now on Peacock or after the broadcast on NBC News Now. And we're going to have lots more to come this season, so look for a new episode of Meet the Press Reports every Friday night at NBC News Now or on demand on Peacock the next day. In fact, next week we tackle artificial intelligence. When we come back, a rare glimpse at Donald Trump under oath.
She would not be my first choice, that I can tell you.
You were referring to her physical looks, correct?
Just the overall, I look at her, I see her, I hear what she says, whatever. You wouldn't be a choice of mine either, to be honest with you. I hope you're not insulted. I would not, under any circumstances, have any interest in you.
Welcome back. Obviously, we were talking about the president's various legal issues, yet we have this new poll out this morning, ABC. And Sarah Fagan, I'm curious of your thoughts on it, because it has Donald Trump, who did a better job handling the economy, Donald Trump, 54%, Joe Biden, 36%. There was 1/4 of voters who would like to see Trump prosecuted for various crimes, think he should be prosecuted, who were picking Trump over Biden. Does it make it impossible to knock Trump out of the nomination?
Well, I don't think it's impossible to knock him out. I mean, you've got to remember it's going to be a long process. And, you know, what happens in Iowa, what happens in New Hampshire, South Carolina, that's going to be very consequential. And even if a candidate, you know, is expected to get 10% and gets 15%, it becomes a week of great press for that person, and the dynamic can change. I do think it's going to be difficult to beat Donald Trump, don't get me wrong. But if you really analyze polling and you ask the question about 4 different ways, Trump's hard support is about 14%. It's not 40. You've got a bunch of people who are for him today that are open to other people. And that's the path that these folks have to put together.
The alarm bell that ought to go off, though, at the White House is that economic number. I mean, if this election is not about abortion rights, they're in trouble.
It's going to be about economy. And I actually think it's going to be about economy and education. I think that a lot of parents right now are seeing that their kids are way far behind. They're saying, who's talking to me about education? The Republicans are. And I do think that the economy, as we see it, there might be inflationary pressures that are going to come. I mean, everybody keeps saying, but it looks like this actually might happen. I think one of the challenges for the Biden administration, though, is to remind the American people who got them out of the pandemic and the real checks. One of the things that we found at Voto Latino was when people supported Donald Trump, it was because they believed that he literally gave them the checks that he signed. And I think it's giving this understanding of the American people that it's much far more complex and who actually got us out of an incredible pandemic.
Garrett, I heard Hakeem Jeffries not make an economic argument. No. I mean, he immediately, well, there's abortion rights, there's a democracy. Like, it reminded me of the Bush 04 days. Hey, this is going to be a choice, not a referendum.
Well, look at the Biden announcement video. I mean, it was a lot of like January 6th and freedom and kind of the same thing that they were trying to run on in 2022, disqualifying Republicans. Biden's going to make that argument against Trump, in part because none of the Republicans are doing it. I mean, they've all hugged him on the January 6th issue. But yeah, I mean, I think the less they can be talking about inflation and the price of eggs or what your mortgage rate's going to be, and the more you can be talking about, look what the other guy's up to, I think that's the play for Democrats.
You know, Mark Leibovich, I want to play something here from from Trump's definition in this defamation trial, because in many ways it is a throwback to 2016. And I'll explain after it. Take a listen.
I don't even know who the woman. Let's see. I don't know who. It's Marla.
You say Marla's in this photo?
That's Marla. Yeah, that's my wife.
Which woman are you pointing to? No.
Here. Oh, is that?
The person you just pointed to was
I
E.
see.
Jean Carroll.
Who is that? Who is this?
Point. Your wife. And the woman on the right is your then wife.
I don't know.
Ivana?
This was the picture. I assume that's John Johnson. Is that?
That's Carol.
Because it's very blurry.
Does it matter, right? Access Hollywood tape didn't matter. Does this stuff matter?
Not among Trump's. I mean, look, no. I mean, look, history would tell us not really. It doesn't move the needle. His supporters are his supporters. They're not going to. They're not watching this, first of all, and making any new determinations. I was a little bit more surprised that this didn't get more pickup, just because it was. I mean, the rest of the video.
Donald Trump under oath. You don't get to see that very often.
Right. I mean, you know, it's. You know, you're not. This is not a great setup for him. I mean, Bill Clinton can attest to that. But I think, look, I mean, it's not. I mean, history shows that this is not going to be something that takes Trump supporters away from it.
Sarah Fagan, the Trump folks have been pushing around this commentary that said it's 2016 again. It's 2016 again, and they are almost embracing it. Hey, we're the outsider. We're not the insider. Can they pull that off?
Well, I don't think they can pull it off. I mean, he's the incumbent party leader, but what I think is going to help him is that, you know, oddly, this calendar of trials appears to be sort of shaping up to have some verdict or some ruling every 2 months, and he gets a sympathy bounce from it. And I had one person from
it's bizarre.
From a rival campaign say the calendar isn't working to our favor to make the, you know.
But the rival.
Isn't that about the voters?
This is what drives me nuts, though, because the rival campaigns could choose to go the other way on this. Every other Republican, theoretical primary candidate or actual primary candidate, has hugged Trump in the face of all these controversies.
I don't think that's. I don't think that's fair.
They could come out and say, "Look, this guy's being credibly accused of rape in this case. He's being charged in Manhattan. Who knows what he's going to be charged with for January 6th?" And instead, they have embraced him so as not to turn his voters off.
The base of the Republican Party believes this is all made up.
Yes,
every
they
one
do,
of these.
but I also do not subscribe to the idea that this is just a godsend to Donald Trump. Prosecution's verdict.
At some point,
Yeah. The reason I don't think it's 2016 is that the majority of American people remember what his presidency was like, and they want a timeout.
Well, we're all going to find out together. That's all we have for today. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week, because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.